correspondent of Politics Joe, Ava Santina Evans, and host of Politico Europe, Sasha O'Sullivan. So welcome back to both of you. And we're going to kick off with the Sunday Telegraph, because they have an article in their paper written by the Prime Minister in which, this is their write-up of it on the front page, in which their headline is Starmer vows to shelter UK from Trump tariffs storm. So what exactly is Keir Starmer saying in the paper?
So this really is the biggest story in town, I think, today. And Keir Starmer is coming out this weekend, after massive shocks last week. We saw £4 billion wiped off the global stock exchange. And here he's trying to reassure businesses and say, look, we're going to look out for you. He's written in the Telegraph, he says, we stand ready to use industrial policy. It's kind of unclear what industrial policy means there, to help shelter British businesses from the storm. In the Telegraph piece, they're talking about, emergency reforms to regulation that will cut red tape, as well as maybe...
Well, they're speculating.
They're speculating there, and suggesting that there might be targeted tax breaks, which is kind of fascinating, because if you then look in the other papers, such as The Observer, they're saying, well, Starmer here is talking about a new global order which could potentially justify tax rises, something that they said they wouldn't do on working people throughout the election campaign last year. And then in the Times, it's kind of been interpreted quite differently as well, and it's about the kind of end of globalisation. And I think this op-ed in the Telegraph is perhaps intentionally vague, I would say, to give them a bit of leeway to figure out what actually is going to go down well. And also, over the last couple of days, they've been having extensive meetings with business leaders in Number 10, saying, what do you need and how can we help in a realistic way when, funding and money in Treasury is really tight.
Well, yeah, I mean, what do you make of it, Ava, this article? Would you say it's possible to read between the lines and interpret what he means by it in terms of action?
Well, I mean, arguably, it may not even have crossed his desk, because it sort of seems like a sort of coagulation or a jumble of phrases that we've heard over the past few months from the Prime Minister.
Are you saying he didn't sit down to write it himself?
Sometimes, perhaps an advisor might help out. Prime Ministers are very busy. But, he talks about keep calm and fight for the best deal. Nobody wins from a trade war. He says we're in a period of national renewal, thanks to his calm and stable leadership. I mean, these are lines that we've heard many, many times, since he came into administration. So there is this... Arguably, perhaps this is rather vague, and deliberately rather vague, because Downing Street is very panicked about how the US will react to any sort of retaliation in terms of tariffs. But, the big argument, I suppose, that he is making, which all of the papers do agree on, is that he doesn't quite want to enter into a trade war, which, by the way, is conflicting with the conversation he had with Macron yesterday, because the statement out of Downing Street was, it's not time for a trade war, but nothing is off the table. So can you see this is sort of extremely vague? We've already got companies that are sort of de facto entering into a trade war. We've got Jaguar Land Rover, who've said that they're not going to export any cars to the US over the next month. You've got Nintendo, which of course is not a British company, but they're saying that they're not going to permit any pre-orders of their new Switch, which is a gaming console. So you've got industry who are entering into a trade war before governments have actually decided that that's the right course of action.
Well, yeah, and this approach has very much been, up until now, calm and considered, no sharp knee-jerk reactions. We're going to take stock, and at the same time putting out this message, don't worry, we're negotiating hard, we're going to try and do a trade deal that makes all the tariff issue go away. Do you think that is reassuring to business, and will an extra message like this, even if it is vague, give businesses some kind of, sense of reassurance?
I mean, I don't think businesses are holding their breath for a US-UK free trade deal, which is something we've been attempting to negotiate. We've tried to do it in multiple ways. We've tried to do state-based free trade deals. And there's always been issues that we've gotten hung up on, like the digital services tax, for example. I do think, to keep his kind of dignity about him, he has to keep retaliatory tariffs on the table. He can't say that we're never going to do this.
They have begun a consultation with businesses.
They have kind of drawing up what Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, calls an indicative list of goods which could have tariffs slapped on them. And that's something he'll be talking to businesses about. But businesses, bear in mind, have known that there will be some kind of tariffs on their goods, and especially car makers. So they were kind of first out of the gate with Jaguar Land Rover, as you were talking about. They will have had plans for this in place, because otherwise you're kind of completely hamstrung. And one of the things that was actually really interesting, it's also in the Telegraph, is you know, suggesting that Starmer would water down
the demands
for electric
Yeah.
cars, and to water down those kind of net zero demands to make it easier and relieve pressures on car makers.
Which has already happened. You know,
Yes.
we saw that under Rishi Sunak. The goal for that was brought back, 5 years? It was brought down to, pushed up to 2035, I think it was, under his government. So it's, you know, how much more can you really water down? You imagine today Ed Miliband, the Energy Secretary, will be furious about that sort of suggestion, because for us to get onto renewables.
Yeah, and you mentioned the different papers having different interpretations. I've got the Observer front page that we can show. That's giving my director probably a moment. He's going to work on that. But also the Sunday Times, as you say, all three papers have a story on their front page about this. And as you say, one of the interpretations is that the kind of language that Keir Starmer is using, there's the Sunday Times front page story, the kind of language he's using about times of change, kind of this sense of the global order being reset, is laying the groundwork for potentially relaxing their own fiscal rules and using it as an excuse to possibly make some uncomfortable changes. Do you think that the public would accept that if they did have to bring in tax rises, for example? Would they think, well, that's fair enough, tariffs have come in, the world looks different?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting interpretation from the Observer, because I read that line as it's a change to, you know, how we are, globalisation, there's a change in how we need to do trade, and there's a change in the global order. The Observer have interpreted that as meaning, well, actually, we're going to need to find the money somewhere, so perhaps the spring statement wasn't sufficient and we need to now bend the fiscal rules, or we need to tax people more. I think it really depends what sort of tax they decide they are going to implement. I think, you know, if they're looking at something like a wealth tax, which has almost become sort of a cliched phrase at this point in time, but a tax on people with assets over £10 million, that polls very well in the country, and I think that that's something that they could get away with. If they go after people who are on welfare again, I think that that could be rather ugly. And, you know, we still haven't had the vote on that in the Commons yet. We don't know how many Labour rebels there are going to be. This could be rather catastrophic for the party.
How do you think, do you think tax rises are likely? Is the Observer going too far suggesting that that could be an outcome? And how do you think they would go down, given that businesses are today coping with the rise in employers' national insurance?
I think they would go down quite badly, and I think they would be it would be politically extremely difficult to introduce that. You know, even when national insurance contributions, you know, was introduced first and now coming in today, there was this sense of, well, you said you wouldn't put up tax on working people. They say this isn't a tax on working people. For a lot of people, it feels like it is. And you know what, it is actually really interesting, because there was some polling out last week about this, about when politicians basically blame economic circumstances on things outside of their control. And there are a lot of things outside of our politicians' control. You know, the war in Ukraine was outside of their control. What Trump decides to do on a kind of Thursday evening is outside of Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer's control. But people don't like to hear that, because they feel like they're out of control of their own financial situation. So to then have the chance of the Exchequer and say, you know what, someone else has done something across the Atlantic, so we're going to have to change things here, is not the message that goes down particularly well.
Yeah, so well, it'll be very interesting. And as we said at this stage, it's all speculation about how the government will react, but it's just interesting to try to read the signs there in the morning papers. Let's move on to other issues. Ava, take us to the front of the Sunday Telegraph. There's an article here about calls by Suella Braverman to release a woman who was jailed over a Southport tweet.
Yeah, so this was Lucy Connolly, who's the wife of a Tory councillor, and just after the Southport, are we calling it a massacre? I think we can call it a massacre, can't we? The stabbings. She got onto social media and she called on people to set fire to the migrant hotels. And she said, if that made me a racist, then so be it. She then took that post down 4 hours later, realising that that was a grave error. But by that point, violence had already ensued in the area, so she was hauled up into court and she was given a sentence of over 30 months. But what Suella Braverman is arguing today is that because she's got a very sick husband and she is eligible for leave from her stay in prison, so she should be allowed to go back and forth. Suella Braverman is arguing that this is politicised and it's not fair, which is rather interesting, because Braverman hasn't spoken about the many other women who are currently in prison for often actually given sentences or handed sentences that do not fit the crime in any sense of the word. There are many women who are in prison for shoplifting, who quite frankly, shouldn't be there. This is the first case that Braverman has spoken up on, and all I can think of is perhaps she's got a touch of jealousy that Robert Jenrick has been doing very well out of publicity on this topic, and perhaps she's following suit.
What she's saying, though, chimes with the words that we've had actually out of Robert Jenrick and other, certainly Conservatives, about two-tier policing and two-tier justice in this country. And they argue that there was the reaction to Southport was very swift. A lot of people were put in prison, and yet a couple of months later, a lot of prisoners were released early from jail. I mean, do you think this message will strike a chord with some from Suella Braverman?
I think it will strike a chord by virtue of the fact we're talking about it. And, you know, the two-tier policing phrase is a phrase that Nigel Farage was using for years and essentially just went viral online. It just went viral on Twitter, or X, as, you know, we now call it, because people felt like, rightly or wrongly, it struck something of the way that they perceived things to be. And when we look at the kind of the way that Southport was dealt with, I mean, there was massive violence. And it's not to say that this mother, you know, this mother's case isn't sad and isn't difficult, but at the time of those riots, Keir Starmer was very, very forthright, and a lot of people were arrested because he had to say, this is not the kind of Britain that we should be living in. And I think what's interesting, actually, is the fact that it was over a tweet or a post on X rather than an actual act. And I think that's where the kind of Suella Braverman, Robert Jenrick find it interesting, because they're like, well, this is a free speech issue. It's not about actually someone on the streets.
We're out of time. We could talk about it all day, but we must say goodbye. Thank you both very much.